Hi, and welcome back to the Mom and Mind podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. On this episode, I am joined by Andrea Owen, and she's sharing her postpartum journey with us through two different postpartum periods and two kind of uniquely different experiences. One of which was of high anxiety and starting to experience symptoms of psychosis. And the other postpartum experience was realizing that she might have some dependence on alcohol and how she dealt with that. She also shares with us a lot of the work she's doing now around empowering women and coaching them to be their best selves. Andrea is an author, a global keynote speaker, and professional certified life coach who helps high achieving women maximize unshakable confidence, master their mindset, and magnify their courage. And she hosts the wildly popular podcast, Make Some Noise. She is the proud author of How to Stop Feeling Like Shit 14 Habits That Are Holding You Back from Happiness, as well as Make Some Noise, Speak Your Mind and Own Your Strength, and 52 Ways to Live a Kick-Ass Life. She's a multiply certified coach, including being a She Recovers coach, as well as a certified Daring Way facilitator. So let's dive right in and meet Andrea. Welcome, Andrea. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Kat. I'm excited for this conversation.
I'm really grateful that you're here to talk about your experience. I know that's what we do here. We talk about
Mhm.
people's stories and more. But I, in particular, appreciate that you're some of the things you're going to be sharing with us today, because I know there are a lot of people who need to know that they're not alone.
Yeah.
So I invite you to start wherever you'd like to with your postpartum experience.
Yeah, postpartum's interesting because when people ask me about it, which doesn't happen all that often, tell me about your postpartum experience.
Hmm.
I immediately think of after the birth of my first child. And I would like to say like, oh, I think of how blissful it was and it was those things too, but my first baby, I was also under a lot of personal stress too, so I don't think that
Hmm.
helped matters. And I had already been diagnosed with anxiety disorder many years before he was born and was on medication then, which was enormously helpful for me,
Hmm.
which was something I kind of fought for a minute. I was in my late 20s at that point. Finally got on meds. It helped a lot. Then I got
Yeah.
pregnant when I was 31, I think. My son was born when I was 32, and I wasn't on any medication at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like the way that I describe it is I felt like I was on the freeway and someone threw the transmission in reverse.
Mm.
Like, that's how I felt hormonally.
Yeah.
Like, I went home with this baby and I didn't know what to do. I had a really hard time nursing him, and my anxiety went through the roof. It got to the point where I
Mhm.
couldn't drive anymore because I was having panic attacks. I was so
Oh,
worried about him, us getting into a car accident. I kept visualizing like someone having like a tire blowout,
mm,
maybe like a quarter
mhm,
mile ahead of
mhm,
us, and then
mhm.
it causing like this 30 pile, 30
Right.
car pile up with this. It was like the most horrific car crash you could
For sure.
imagine, like movie style, like
Yeah.
was kept repeating in my brain.
Right. Like
And then
visually, we could
visually this
see
was
it. Yeah.
happening. I
Yeah.
could see it happening.
Those
And then I would
intrusive
white
thoughts. Yeah.
knuckle the steering wheel and I would like get all the way. I could only drive in the slow lane on the freeway. And it got to the
Hmm.
point where I was so panicked, I realized that it was unsafe for me to be driving.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and then fairly quickly, I don't even think I had been home a week with him, and I was convinced that I was legitimately convinced that someone or someone's was going to come into our house and steal him
Oh no.
for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And I remember the kind of the breaking point where I realized that I was very, very unwell
Mm.
was my mom was staying with us those first couple weeks, thank goodness. And I remember holding him, my son Colton, to my chest, and he was so tiny. He was 3 weeks early, and he was
Mm.
just a teeny tiny little thing. And I remember like clutching him to my chest and whispering to my mom. I remember standing in the hallway. I was whispering to her, and I said, "They're going to come and take him.
Mm.
I can't." Like I couldn't even, speak louder than a whisper. And she said, "Honey, who?" And I
Ah.
was like, "Them, the people." And then if you've ever had your mother look at you like they're nervous, like
Mm.
they're like,
Hmm.
you're not okay. Like that look,
Uh-huh.
I will never forget. She's
Oh.
looked at me like that one other time in my life when I was very deep in my eating disorder in my mid-20s when she
Mm,
saw me for the first time in a long time, and I'll never forget it. But I'm grateful for that because it was that moment where I had the self-awareness to think, okay, something's not right with my brain and
mm,
I need to get help. So I did, and the reason I wanted to tell that story is because, what I had found out from doctors and psychologists was the beginnings of postpartum psychosis,
mm,
and, the way I tell people, I said I kind of danced with it a little bit.
mhm,
I
mhm,
think I'm one of the lucky ones that didn't go too far down the path of it, and I was able to be put on medicate the appropriate medication to help,
mhm.
um, but I think stories like that are important because we hear
Yeah.
stories where it does go on for a long time and people go to a much darker place and there are dire consequences of that. But I hope that, my story can show that it's a spectrum.
Yeah,
It's a spectrum.
absolutely it is. And you're right. Yeah, those some of the stories that get on the news also end up being sensationalized and misconstrued and talked about
Hmm.
in inaccurate ways, which further complicates what how people think about it.
Right.
But you're right, it does happen within like a spectrum of experience from sort of, if you can call it, relatively mild to more intense. But it, from what you're describing, it sounds like it was kind of caught pretty early. So what, like,
Yes.
can you remind me again how far postpartum you were when you
I
had
was
that?
only I don't even know if he had been home. Well, I was in the hospital for a week because of some complications with my blood
Mm,
pressure.
mm,
I was severely high blood pressure to the point where my stepmother, who was a L&D nurse, labor and
oh,
delivery nurse, not at that hospital where I was at,
uh-huh.
but another one, I heard her yelling at a doctor in the hallway saying, It's so bad. She's going to have a seizure if
Oh,
somebody doesn't
oh
adjust
my
her blood pressure
gosh.
medication.
So
So
you'd
I
already
was
been
very
through
sick.
so much.
Yes, I had a C-section because he was a breech baby and he was 3 weeks early, which scared me. He was my
Mm,
first baby,
mhm,
and so
mhm.
yeah, so
Yeah.
it was maybe 2 weeks postpartum
Mm,
when the my mental health kinda took a turn.
okay. And do you
Mhm.
recall if you'd been sleeping or not?
No, I had not been sleeping well at all. I mean,
Mm,
of course, like all new mothers, like, nursing through the night, and plus he was very colicky, and it was my
mhm,
first time nursing,
mhm.
and my mom at one point even said, like, "Honey, you might wanna consider, just, you know, switching to formula," and I was like,
Mhm,
"No, I'm gonna do
mhm,
this."
mhm, mhm,
And I did eventually got it, but looking back, I'm like, I could have given myself some grace.
mm.
But, I partly because of that, because he was colicky, he wasn't sleeping well, I was having
Yeah,
trouble nursing,
yeah,
he was my first baby, so
yeah,
I was
yeah.
minimally sleeping,
Right.
which
So
wasn't
you're
helping.
like you're up and vigilant and checking and
High alert.
yeah,
Mhm.
super
Yeah,
high alert.
yeah,
Okay, so great that it got caught on the early end, but it doesn't just like go away the next day.
right.
What was it like after that? After you
You
started
know
getting
what?
help for it?
I don't remember.
Mm,
A lot of that is a blur to me. I
mm,
I vividly remember that conversation with her in the hallway and vaguely remember seeing my therapist and seeing my doctor, who had been my doctor for a long time, and I think they may have in cahoots is not the word I'm looking for.
mhm.
They may have consulted with each
Right, right.
as I am grateful that
Uh-huh.
they did. I'm sure I had to give them permission to do that, but somewhere in within those weeks, I was able to get put back on medication. I was worried about it with nursing and,
Yeah.
breastfeeding him and, but it ended up subsiding. The
Hmm.
anxiety did stick around, but it
Hmm.
wasn't as severe as it was before. It took me a
Okay.
while to be able to drive again. It took a few months.
Okay, right. So that's quite a span of
Mhm.
time to just
Yeah,
kind of be recovering from that experience.
yeah,
Well, the mental health part of it on its own is hard, but there you're also talking about physical recovery
yeah.
and transition into being a new parent and
Mhm.
figuring out that job. And there's so much happening during that really compressed and intense period of
Yeah,
time
and
to try.
recovering from a cesarean
Yeah.
surgery is not easy. I think it's again that's another one of those things that's just really not talked about
Yeah.
how difficult that is, like major abdominal surgery, and then you have a
Right.
newborn. And for
Right.
some people, they have toddlers at home or other
Right.
children. Like, woof, it's a lot.
It is a lot, a lot.
Mhm.
Okay, so did the people around you, I guess, friends and or family or whatever, know what was going on, or did it feel like a kind of a private process? Um,
Yeah, I don't think that at that time I was very hesitant to share it with anyone because of the shame I felt
yeah,
around it.
right.
I was also, and this may have been part of the anxiety and or the psychosis, where I was aware that if I told the wrong people,
Mm-hmm.
that they would take him away from me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I was so hesitant to even let my mom in
Mm-hmm.
on, because at that moment when she looked at me, I had a moment of fear thinking, is she is
Mm-hmm.
she going to rat on me?
Mm-hmm.
And like, is she going to take him away from me? You know, what
Right.
if anybody's going to take my baby and raise it, I would want it to be my mother. But at
Right.
the same time,
Right.
I was on the fence with trusting her. And so, no, I kept it pretty private. And I am, I'm not one to not share things, but that had a grip on me at the time where
Right.
I thought no one can be trusted.
Oh, sure. Right. I
Mm.
mean, if you have fear plus, I guess, shame, um, fear plus
Coupled
shame
with like
is,
and that fear is like about protecting your newborn baby, like
yeah,
that
yeah,
that
yeah.
protection is there is something to be said about that mama bear
Mm-hmm.
feeling that we have.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was rough.
And then you get like super internal,
Mhm.
at that point.
Yeah, I did. I went
Um,
inward.
for sure. Which, of course, like those are reasonable responses for that kind
Mhm.
of intense experience.
Yeah.
And also, then you're alone.
Yeah.
Like, if nobody knows what you're going through, it kind of like compounds how you're feeling too.
Right. And just staying there feeling isolated.
Right. So, how long would you say it took for you to kind of feel back to yourself or your new self or however it felt to you?
Yeah. It took a few months, probably, I would say at least 3 months until he kind of grew out of that colicky phase. I mean, he
Mm,
was crying every afternoon, like around 5 o'clock, like clockwork.
mm,
So once, and I think a lot of people listening can relate if they've lived through that or are living through it right now.
mhm.
That time, unfortunately, looking back, becomes sort of a haze.
Sure.
Just the lack of sleep, just when you don't know how to fix the problem,
Yeah.
it can feel very it's overwhelming. And so to make good core memories, it was kind of non-existent. But I do remember once that like 3 or 4 month period and he got a little bit bigger and and then could like hold his head up and was
Mhm,
smiling and
mhm,
like
mhm,
those types of things, I started to feel better.
mhm.
They're just, I mean, I love the newborn phase, but like when you move into like the infant phase, it's
Yeah.
a little
Yeah. They're not just
the
like blobs
milestones,
anymore.
right, that just cry and poop their pants. But yeah. So it took a few months.
Oh, well, right. So that's a significant chunk of time
Hmm.
to be struggling. Especially like we already touched on, but to be in the process of figuring out who you are as a mom,
The new mom.
as a partner too, and as
Hmm.
a parent to this new human, and who you are with yourself. And there's so many transitions happening at the same time
Yeah.
concurrently.
Yeah. It is. And it's I think especially with the firstborn, like you
Mm,
said, like creating a new identity as a mother and as a partner, when
mhm,
previously there were no children,
mhm,
and then also thinking about the future, and am I going to be able, mentally and emotionally, am I going to be able to have more children? And I wanted to, and
right.
it can be incredibly overwhelming.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. So, did you get to a point where you were comfortable with having another or wanting to try
Yeah.
for another?
Hmm.
Okay. How long did
Yeah.
that
So
take you?
I
Yeah.
got pregnant. I think my son was 15 months old. They're 25 months apart.
Mhm.
So it was, yeah, when he was about maybe 9 months old, and that had turned out to be like my favorite stage, like 6 months to about 22 months, like still even other people's babies. And I'm like, oh my God, give me that baby. It's such a, that was my favorite, when they
Mhm.
can sit up and you carry them around on your hip all the time and they're drooly and they don't really talk that much. They're just starting to form words. Like, and that is my absolute favorite. So I think
Mhm.
that had something to do with it. You're just like
Right.
leaning in and loving that part of
Yeah.
infancy into toddlerhood. And so my husband at the time and I were incredibly lucky and had no trouble getting pregnant again. And then we had our daughter in 25 months after our son was born.
Okay. And did you experience anything postpartum like you had before with her?
It was a very different experience in that I, of course, had already been through it before. And
Mhm.
also, I was really starting to do my own personal growth work
Mm.
during that time and was doing my best to listen to my intuition. Uh, the long and short of it, too, was that the hospital that I gave birth to with my son, it was sort of an assumption for them that I would have a repeat cesarean section.
Oh.
And that surprised me. I wasn't aware that that was just sort of a given. And so I started to look into it a little bit
Mhm.
and found, so I don't know if you've ever heard of the documentary, The Business of Being Born.
Mhm.
It had just come out around that
Oh,
time in
okay.
'09,
Uh-huh.
the year my
Uh-huh.
daughter was born, and so that was new. I even went to a rally and met Ricky Lake, who's one of the producers of the documentary, and found, an organization called ICAN. It's about,
Mhm.
it's just advocating for being able to have a vaginal birth after cesarean
Yeah.
and birthing mothers' rights and learned all I could about that. Hired a doula, which was incredible.
Nice.
If
Yeah.
you can afford it, please look into it.
Yeah.
She was amazing, and I was able to have a successful VBAC, but I had to also kind of like quote unquote play the game with the hospital.
Mm.
Um, because I mean, this isn't to say I think cesareans save lives. I think that hospital births can be great and
Mhm.
hospitals save lives.
Mhm.
And at the end of the day, they are a business.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it was a very different experience because I was working through that and also spent some intentional time tapping into my intuition and really truly listening to my body and the
Nice.
wisdom that it was giving me, especially during pregnancy. I felt like it was even more clear.
Yeah.
I would take a bath, especially towards the end. I would take a bath every single night. It was a luxury when you are that big in the summertime in San
Oh.
Diego.
Oh.
Let me tell you.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and I just kept sort of doing these like little mini meditations, and I just felt like my daughter
Nice.
was telling me like everything's fine, everything's fine, because
That's great.
the doctors were telling me they were kind of giving me worst case scenarios. So it was a much different experience. And then postpartum, I it was I was able to nurse her a lot easier. I actually nursed her for 2.5 years,
Mm.
and just everything felt a lot more natural, partly because I leaned in finally
Mm.
to understanding that my body knew what to do. Like, it was great to get help from lactation nurses and books here and there.
Mhm.
And my mom told me, she said, "Honey, sometimes I think that you have too much information at your fingertips."
Oh, okay.
And she's not wrong,
Uh-huh.
like,
Like you're
she had
trying
babies
to
a long time
absorb all
ago.
of this and
Like,
like figure out the
I
right
was
way
second
or
yeah, I was second guessing my own
Mhm.
instincts.
Oh.
And there are some things I do think that for some mothers just don't feel instinctual.
Mhm.
So I don't wanna say that, but
Right.
I wasn't trusting myself. And so
Mhm.
with my second baby, I did my best to lean into that a little
Mhm.
more, and it
Mhm.
was actually incredibly helpful, and I had a lot
That's great.
easier experience.
Oh, that's awesome. So not as much of that high anxiety.
Mm-mm.
Didn't touch on
No,
any
I
kind of
was able
psych.
to drive with my toddler and my newborn in the car. She, on the other hand, hated the car, but
Oh,
I was okay. She was one of those babies, screamed,
yeah,
screamed. That was excruciating as a mom.
that's brutal.
But yeah, it was a very different experience. I have better memories from the newborn phase with her.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, it was great.
So during that time, I'm glad that you didn't have such an intense experience and
Mhm.
recovery process. But during that time, can you talk a little bit about the other challenge you had?
Yeah. So it was during my second pregnancy, I realized that I probably had an issue with my consumption of alcohol. So with my first pregnancy, it wasn't that difficult for me to stop drinking. At that point, I was a wine drinker.
Mhm.
I think nothing alarming.
Mhm.
Um, but after my son was born, I started to kind of get that sort of tap on the shoulder where maybe I shouldn't, maybe it's not necessary that I have a drink, that I've wined so many nights a week. It wasn't even every night, but it was
Mhm.
probably a little bit more than I should. And I would look forward to it so much at the end of the day. And then when I got pregnant for the second time with our daughter, I realized how much harder it was for me to stop.
Mm.
And I found myself like sneaking gulps of wine here and there if I was at a party and a friend had a
Mhm.
glass of wine. I'd be
Mhm.
like, hide me
Mhm.
and take a big chug of wine, just a big sip, and that was it. But it was difficult in terms of I kept thinking about it. I thought
Oh,
about it
okay.
a lot more than I thought was normal. Like,
Mhm.
does everyone have
Mm.
this hard of a
Mhm.
time? Is everyone this obsessed as I am? And didn't tell anybody. And then after she was born, I nursed her and I picked wine right back up. And I
Mhm.
I pumped and dumped a little bit, but probably not as much as I should. And I found myself
Mhm.
googling like how much wine can I drink and
Mhm.
still breastfeed, and
Mhm.
it was really teetering on the edge of probably what was healthy and feeling
Mhm.
incredible guilt and shame about it.
Mhm.
Feeling like the worst mother, didn't want to tell anyone
Mhm.
because I was worried if I told someone, I mean, obviously the shame, and thinking that once I said it out loud, it became a real problem and that I
Uh-huh.
couldn't back out.
Right.
And that I knew that I would really have to look at it. And I also knew that might mean not drinking anymore and getting sober. And
Right.
just to kind of clarify, the reason that I had a feeling sobriety was on the horizon for me was because when I was 18, I watched my dad get sober,
Wow.
and he was never a drunk. And so it was then that I learned what a quote unquote high functioning alcoholic was.
Uh-huh.
And there was
Yeah.
that voice in the back of my mind that thought, like, this might be where I'm at. It's very similar symptoms to my
Oh,
dad.
okay.
So
Like you
that's why. And I
recognized
didn't
it.
want to
Mhm.
moderate. Like, when I thought about that, I was like, that sounds like the worst thing in the world to me. Like,
Like to just reduce the amount you're drinking? Is that what you mean?
yeah, it
Uh-huh.
felt, the way I describe it is, it felt like if I was working out in the yard all day long and, from 7 o'clock in the morning and then it's 5 o'clock at night and I have had zero to eat. Like, I'm starving and you cook me my favorite meal.
Mhm.
And I'm like, Kat, thank you so much for this meal. I cannot
Mhm.
wait to sit down. I'm starving. And
Mhm.
then you say, you can have one bite, Andrea.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's what moderation felt like to me.
Okay.
Like,
Impossible.
horrible.
Right, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Like a
Like
joke,
too
like a
much. Yeah.
cruel joke.
Right. Right. Okay.
So
So
yeah,
that
so
was
that
like
was,
immediately off the table.
yeah, she was born in September of '09. She's just about to be 15 now. Lord help me. And I mean, like, just because the time has gone by so fast. And so I got sober in May of 2011. So it took me a minute after
Mhm.
she was born to really sit down and look at it and realize that I needed to abstain. And then so May 2011, and then I relapsed in September of that same year. And
Mhm.
so from then on, I have not had a drink. So at the end of this month will mark 13 years that I've been sober.
Wow. Wow.
Mhm.
That's amazing.
Thank
That's
you.
great that you were able to do that. And
Yeah.
I'm, to just like kind of reflecting back on the experience you had when she was young, that cycle that you're in of like the need and the desire for the thing that whatever it did for you to help you feel better, help you worry less, I don't know,
Mhm.
like whatever
A
it
lot
did
of things.
for you, um to let go of the thing that's kind of helping you feel better
Right.
at the same time that you feel the guilt and shame about it. I mean, it's such a stuck feeling.
Yes.
For I don't know that maybe you have better words for it. Um, but it sounds like it was a constant battle.
It was.
Like you need or want and need, and you shouldn't, and then you feel bad, and then um,
It was Groundhog Day every
mm,
day.
mhm,
And no, you described it beautifully, and I appreciate that. And that's exactly how it was. And it really wasn't, for anyone listening who either is questioning their own alcohol consumption or over drinking, or loves somebody, cares about somebody that is in that place,
Mhm.
it's never really about the quantity that we're drinking.
Mhm.
So I even hesitate to, when people ask the question like how much were you drinking? I hesitate to answer because
Mm.
when I was in that place and I heard people say how much they were drinking,
Mhm.
I would always think like, well, I'm not that bad. Like
Ah,
I'm not
right.
hiding alcohol.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah, yeah.
not I've never had a DUI.
Mhm.
I've never, you make this
Mhm.
list of things that convince you that you're not that bad when really the problem was the obsession.
Mm.
It was the amount of space that it was taking up in my mind. And
Mhm.
I would wake up every morning feeling terrible physically, and I would still
Sure.
go on a
Yeah.
run with the double jogger because to prove to myself and everybody else
Wow.
that I was okay.
Wow.
And then I would decide I'm not going to drink that night, and I can go. It's a Monday night. I can go one night
Mhm.
without drinking. Come on, it's
Mhm.
not that bad. And then 3 o'clock would roll around, and then the anxiety would start to rise.
Yeah.
And the anxiety was a combination of having a baby and a toddler at home. It was the grief
Yep.
of, things that had happened in the past that I had not dealt with yet.
Mm.
It was trying to figure out what my identity was as a new mom,
Right.
and a retired party girl. Really
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
what I was also grieving, like
Right, right.
my single life, and also desperately wanting to start a business and write a book and like do all these things that I
Mm.
really felt passionately about, but just
Mm.
did not have the capacity, energy, or childcare to do it at the time. So it was a combination of a lot of
Yeah.
things swirling around that anxiety would rise. And then I would suddenly say, like, well, we're out of garlic and I'm making something tonight that needs garlic. So I'd go
Mhm.
to, Trader Joe's or whatever and also grab a bottle or two of wine and
Mhm.
along with the
Mhm.
garlic and just like, oh,
Mhm.
well, I'll just, and then
Mhm.
swear that I would cut back. And it was just every day. It was something
Mhm.
similar to that.
Right. So, I mean, sometimes that's like swearing to cut back thing is internal. Sometimes it's external. I don't know if anybody around you knew what was going on or not. But that cycle of, thinking or wanting to cut back or quit, and then of feeling the pull in, not kind of sort of quote unquote being able to, then the relief you get like
Yeah.
from doing that,
Mhm.
and then the shame and the yeah that part of the cycle. That other part of it that is so hard is that like the all of the kind of promises that you make and break
Mhm.
for yourself, even if
Yeah.
nobody else is included in that process. That it's somehow you're like kind of gaslighting yourself a little bit,
Yeah.
not because you don't actually want to quit, but it's hard to like get to that point where you feel like, oh yeah, it's going, that thing that I want to happen to quit, let's say for this is gonna happen, and that feels good.
Mhm.
And then when you can't or don't, um, that's just another layer of like guilt and shame and
Yeah.
stuff
Of
that,
self-abandonment,
uh-huh,
and that's
yeah,
what a lot of, as I do this work a decade and a half later, self-trust still is something that I'm working on, and it just sort
mm,
of like takes many forms as I've gotten older and as I've
mm-hmm,
dealt with different obstacles in my life. And there's the self-trust of knowing that everything was okay with my body when I was
mm,
pregnant with my daughter. It's the self-trust of listening to my intuition when it was tapping me on the shoulder saying like you should really talk to
mm,
someone about your
mm,
drinking.
mm,
And back then it wasn't even saying like you need to quit completely. It was just
mm-hmm,
saying like you should look at this. Like,
mm-hmm,
this isn't
mm-hmm,
okay for you anymore.
mm-hmm.
And so I started using the term self abandonment because it does feel like it felt like I like that you use the term like gaslighting because that's what I was doing. I was
Mhm,
convincing myself that there wasn't a problem. I was
mhm,
convincing
mhm,
myself that it wasn't that bad. I
mhm.
had to in order to
Yeah,
keep the symptom
yeah,
going.
yeah,
But
yeah,
it's really, I think that it's one of those situations too where both outcomes are scary and terrible.
yeah,
Both are.
right.
So the way I describe it to people is and everyone's pain tolerance is different,
Yeah.
but each individual has to get to that place where the fear of saying it out loud that you have a problem and
Mhm,
or reaching out and being vulnerable to someone. In my case, I had a friend that had many years of recovery that I reached out to.
mm,
That fear of doing that and possibly quitting is a little bit less than the fear of continuing down the path that you're
Mhm.
going down.
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
I knew deep down, and it kept getting louder and louder and more clear, that if I continued down this path, and even
Mhm.
when I would do research online, especially like women and alcohol, it's grim. Like
Mhm.
it wasn't looking
Mhm.
good
Right, right.
for me, and like I was not going to get better as much as I tried.
Yep.
I
Yeah,
knew
it's tough.
what my habits are, and I knew the way my brain worked. And so getting to that tipping point
Mhm.
was the pivotal decision maker where I decided to reach out and get help and ultimately abstained. Mhm.
Right, right. Well, congratulations.
Thank
It's
you.
tough. It's hard
It
work.
was. It's easier now,
Mm.
but and we can get into this more or not, but recovery and sobriety are two very different things.
Mm.
Sobriety is just quitting drinking,
Mhm.
which to me isn't that hard. It was the staying quitting drinking
Mm.
and also the recovery piece. So that was like looking
Mm.
at, because the drinking is just a symptom. Like it
Mhm.
really could be
Mhm.
anything. Like
Mhm.
in order to truly be quote unquote sober and recover, you have to look at the underlying issues that pushed you to drink in the first place.
Right.
It was a non-negotiable for me to not do that.
Mhm.
So that's when you say congratulations, that's what I take that to mean. Like, 'cause that was
That
the hard
you
part.
did the work
Oh,
to
continue to do, like, it's
and
never
continue.
done. Yeah,
Yeah.
every day.
Yeah, it's such a worthwhile pursuit though.
Mhm.
I mean,
It is.
what else is better than for yourself, like is what I
Mhm.
mean, like to figure out your why and how you work and what gets in the way and what helps, all that stuff.
Yeah.
It's always surprising to me, and I've been in the mental health field for a long time, but it's always surprising to me how hard it is to get to know yourself and be yourself.
Yeah.
It just you would think like you're with you all the time.
Yep.
It should feel like not this hard, but it is because you've got all of these other people's stuff just clogging up your own system.
Mhm. 100%. Yeah, and we also evolve and change over time.
Yep.
This has been a topic that I've been thinking about a lot lately when it comes to even long marriages.
Mm.
Like
Hmm.
I think it's kind of a miracle that people stay together for even a decade. That
Right.
is some
Right.
hard stuff.
Yeah, it
And
is.
like I don't feel like I have a failed marriage. I think it was a huge success that we were together
Hmm.
for 16,
Hmm.
17 years.
Hmm.
Like we
Hmm.
both changed. I mean, I changed
Hmm.
a lot. Like
Hmm.
I don't push back on that when some,
Right.
if he or someone else says like you've changed a lot. Like you're right. I have.
Yeah. Right.
Especially if someone gets sober. Like
Hmm.
you're going to change a lot, and it's okay if you don't particularly like the new person,
Hmm.
and if you
Hmm.
fall out of love with that person, and
Hmm.
the relationship ends up ending. Like, is it
Hmm.
sad?
Hmm.
Incredibly sad.
Hmm. Hmm.
Gutting.
Hmm.
Absolutely gutting.
Right.
But I do think that there's something to be said for calling relationships that last a long time, that end, calling them a success instead of a
Hmm.
failure.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, it does take work for sure
Mhm.
all the time.
So much.
So in the well, since your kids, oh well, I'm going to pause here and start over. In when your kids were young, you
Mhm.
started writing books,
Yes.
and
Still
and
surprises me.
started to help and support other people. What did you
Yeah.
say?
It still surprises me
Oh,
that I managed to do that. Like,
yeah.
that was rough. Yeah,
Hmm.
that was hard.
Was that part of your healing process or about things you were learning along the way, or what prompted the books?
Well, I had been blogging since about '07. So this was like
Mhm.
the glory days of blogging. And that's really what kicked off my life coaching business. So I went to school around that time to be certified with Coaches Training Institute, and then officially launched my online business in 2010.
Mhm.
And then when I got sober in 2011, I announced to my husband at the time, I'm like, I think I'm going to write a book. And I had wanted to forever since I was a child, but
Mm.
just never knew what it would be about. I kind of
Yeah.
always thought I would write a novel or something. But I took my blog and just pulled pieces from that and wrote a book proposal and got an agent and a book deal. And this was during the time where it was a little bit easier to get a book deal. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't say that to undermine my talent. I just say it because it's the reality of what was happening there, you know, in the landscape. And yeah, I just, with bits and pieces of time that I had and got childcare. And at that point, my son was in preschool.
Mm-hmm.
And then we moved to Utah and my mom helped out with childcare, but it was hard. It was really hard. It
Mm-hmm.
was lots of blood, sweat, and tears.
Right.
Um, but I'm grateful because it's really what kicked off my career as an author. And to answer your question more specifically, yes, it was things that I had learned along the way. I'm actually in the process right now as we're recording this of revising that book because it came out 11 years ago and there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot that's changed. And but yeah, it was really just sort of here's what I've learned from grief and being motivated and inspired and just life in general.
That's great. So, but three books. That's
3
not just one
now.
book. Three now.
Yeah, 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 over the years. So
Okay.
that first book, 52 Ways to Live a Kick-Ass Life, came out in 2014, January 2014. And then How to Stop Feeling Like SHIT. I don't know if I can curse on your podcast.
You can.
That
That's
came
fine.
out in January 2018. And that book has been by far my most successful, translated into 20 languages. It's insane. And then Make Some Noise came out, it was a pandemic baby, came out in
Ah,
2021.
and what is that book?
Make Some Noise.
No, yeah. What? Sorry. What is that book about?
That one was slightly different than my first two. My first two were sort of straight up and down women's empowerment. And Make Some Noise, my third book, was a slight deviation in that it was still women's empowerment, but it was specifically, I was pointing towards our culture
Mm.
that, a lot of these tricky behaviors that women struggle with and that oftentimes come to me for coaching. So this is having leaky boundaries, people pleasing, perfectionism,
Mm-hmm.
isolating instead of reaching out, numbing out instead of
Mm-hmm.
reaching out.
Mm-hmm.
Many times we employ these behaviors because of our culture has
Mm-hmm.
taught us to be nice and kind all the time at
Right.
our own expense, to put everyone else's comfort before our own, never make
Right.
a scene, never rock the boat.
Right.
And so it was sort of a little bit of a middle finger to our culture
Great.
because we're following the rules. We're following
Uh-huh.
the rules, and I see it causing a lot of uh and everything from anxiety to grief to rage in
Mm-hmm.
women that
Yeah.
goes unprocessed and unrecognized. So it was sort of a
Mm-hmm.
love letter to that.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So, the book writing process is a grind.
Oh yeah.
Uh, for you to pump out three
Yeah.
is a big deal.
Hmm.
It is a big
It
deal.
was. I don't necessarily look back on it with being a lot of fun, but I also don't
That's
love
fair.
being like a creative martyr. I love having had written. Is that how you say it
Yeah,
grammatically?
sounds great.
I don't love the process of
I'm not an
writing.
English teacher, so you're
Yeah,
good.
I still have a hard time with it,
Hmm.
and but I love having written though. I mean,
That's great.
that part is amazing.
And when did you start podcasting?
2013.
Nice.
That came from because I was writing my first book and I was a blogger previously, and
Hmm.
everything that I was writing was going into the book. And I felt like I just was wrung out in terms of like, I'm like, I can't have content for my blog and the book. It just felt like too much. So I
Yeah.
just bought a $40 microphone from Amazon and turned it on and started a podcast. And this was like way in the beginning,
Yeah.
again, early adopter of podcasting. And that's how it was born. So I have over 600 episodes, and I go back
Nice.
and listen to that first 100 cat, and I'm like, Lord,
I feel you.
please.
Yeah, I feel
Yeah, I've
you.
come a
I,
long way. And I appreciate it because it's trained me to be
sure.
able to, be better behind the microphone and
Hmm.
show up for media appearances with a lot of experience.
That's great. And helping a lot of people along the
Yeah.
way through your books and the podcast and
Yeah,
coaching
yeah.
and the stuff that
Mhm.
you're offering. I
I'm
mean,
blessed.
I a lot of people who go on to do things like books and podcasts, who are doing it from some of it based in their own experience. Like it's transformative to go through the things that you've been through.
Sure.
There's no doubt. Like you were talking about being a different person, and these life experiences have propelled you into these new phases of who you are. Um, and then to be able to additionally put that out in a way that's also helpful for other people
Mhm.
is, I'm always amazed at that.
Thank
It's a real
you.
skill.
I feel like yes, it's a skill, and also I just had some like major personality tests ran on me from one of my clients. She was on my podcast about human design and gene keys, and it's so fascinating to me that my gene keys came back as like this is what I was meant to do. This was like based on like birthday and things like that, and it's interesting to me because I've always felt like the black sheep
Mm-hmm.
as someone who's a seeker who, even as a young child, felt things very, very deeply and
Mm-hmm.
was confused by them, and also
Right, right.
didn't necessarily have the space to talk about the hard things. Even though I was afraid to talk about them, I was very interested in it and felt
Mm-hmm.
pulled towards them.
Mm-hmm.
But uh, again, just being kind of, shut down and dismissed. I'm a Gen Xer, it's like, it's not what we did back then. And
Right.
feeling like there was something wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was given the opportunity to blog, I just word vomited. It's like, here's all of my stuff. And really didn't know anybody would be interested or
Mm-hmm.
read it. It was really
Mm-hmm.
more for me, like Dear
Right.
Diary.
Right.
And there was an element of exhilaration of
Mm-hmm.
putting it out there. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
what are people going to think? And I wasn't ever really all that scared. I think again because I don't know what it is about me with like having loose vulnerability, but it did turn out to be a good thing.
Right.
And
Right.
people read it and
Mm-hmm.
said like me too, and that
Mm-hmm.
really is what changed everything of
Yeah.
speaking from my heart and
Mm-hmm.
talking about my experiences and the emotions that go with them,
Mm-hmm.
not just the facts,
Right.
not just to here's what happened, but also here's how I felt. And having people DM me or email me and say, thank you for putting into words what I have felt and didn't understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That will forever be payment enough for me
Totally.
to be able to connect with other humans, especially other women
Yeah.
who felt like they were never heard.
Right. Right. And I think that there was something so transformative about blogging. First everybody had a blog, now everybody has a podcast. I don't know what
Right.
everybody's going to have next.
I know.
But
Something with AI, maybe.
probably, oh gosh, no. Yeah, you're right. I know it was sort of like a joke about blogging and podcasting, but it was one of the first times that people were sort of bearing their souls in a way
Mhm.
that other people could reflect on and see themselves in. There, we didn't really have a platform like that before. And I think podcasting has taken that and sort of intensified it or expanded it in a way, because now it's conversational also.
Yeah,
um, and I like, I'm sure you hear it all the time, but the reflection that you had, that people hear what you have to say or hear your story or some part of your story, and that helps them potentially get to the next part of their healing. Like, you don't know where this goes when you put it out.
right.
It just goes, and it
Yeah.
lands hopefully where it needs to.
Yeah, and one thing that I've learned over the years, and I've been able to hone this, especially if I'm speaking from the stage and I'm telling a story, it really is about not so much making it about me, even though it is me. And every time I tell a story, is to think about what are the universal truths within
Mm-hmm.
the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's what I stumbled upon on accident when I
Mm-hmm.
was blogging. And
Mm-hmm.
so, people would say, like, because I was back then, I was as an early adopter, people always wanted to know like how you did it. And I am very transparent and say, like, I did it on accident.
Mm-hmm.
Like I never meant to use vulnerability as a strategy.
Mm-hmm.
I did it because I felt like if I didn't tell this story, and for the sake of sounding really dramatic, but I kind of felt like I might die. I
Mm-hmm.
was so starving to
Mm-hmm.
be seen and heard
Mm-hmm.
around my emotions. That was, it was probably my inner teenager that was just angsty still,
Mm-hmm.
begging for someone to see and hear her. And in
Yeah.
fact, I have a picture. If people aren't watching this on video, you won't see, but there's my kids on one side, and then it's my high school senior picture that was
Oh,
actually in my
nice.
dad's house. And when he passed away, I took it and put it up here because so much of the work I do now is for her. In many ways, it's
Mhm.
reparenting myself. It's
Mhm.
being able to, because I realized a lot of my toxic ways of behaving and
Mm.
toxic ways of thinking were from that. Were
Mhm.
from
Mhm.
that stage in my
Mhm.
life of not being able to express the grief and rage
Right.
that I had
Right.
for various reasons. And so that's what I want people to see in themselves, to be able to
Mhm.
touch the emotions,
Mhm.
because I'm a true believer that when we do that, we heal parts of ourselves. And by
Yeah.
processing and naming our emotions, that is where our magic is when it comes to creativity, when it comes to
Mhm.
connection, when it comes to love. Like all of
Mhm.
these very important things are
Mhm.
tied to our emotions. So
Absolutely.
that's kind of full circle of the work that I do. And also I would not be able to do that had I still been drinking.
Oof. Right. I
Because I
guess
was
it would
stuffing it
have
all
been
down.
like covered it up.
Yeah, it stuffed it all down because I was
Mhm.
so terrified of what was underneath. That was a large piece of why I drank.
Yeah.
And I knew fairly early on in my 20s, I considered going to grad school to be a therapist because I thought I would be decent at it. And I really liked my therapist. And I also very quickly realized I didn't want to be with anybody else's feelings.
Mm.
I didn't want to be in the same room as
Mm.
someone who was like hour after hour after hour pouring their feelings out into the room. And the
Mhm.
reason was I didn't want to be with anybody else's feelings because I could not be with my own.
Mm.
I could
Mm.
not bear
Mhm.
what I call the primal scream
Mhm.
that was residing inside of me
Mhm.
that I would
Mhm.
not release because I was stuffing it down for so
Well,
long. And so it took me a long
absolutely.
time to see that.
Absolutely. I mean, right, if it, sort of extrapolating from what you're saying, but like if you're somebody who needs to be seen and heard, it is hard to be the person that's seeing and hearing everybody else and still
Yep.
being sort of like not getting what you need.
Yeah. It was
Yeah.
simultaneously the thing that I wanted the most
Hmm.
and the
Hmm.
thing I was the most terrified of.
Right, right,
So it
right.
was a weird pickle to be in, and I didn't realize that until I got sober,
Hmm.
until I really looked at my codependence
Hmm.
issues
Hmm.
and looked at a lot of the symptoms that I had that pointed towards my dysfunctional thinking and then
Hmm.
subsequently my dysfunctional behavior.
Hmm.
And also really gave myself a lot of grace for that
Hmm.
because it's easy to beat yourself up
No
for
doubt.
getting there.
Yeah.
So it was a process and it's still a work in progress, but that's sort of what it looked like.
So yeah, with all of the work that you're doing, what do you talk about on the podcast, or what are the things that you really address on the podcast and you do in your work now?
Yeah, a lot of my podcast is having experts on to talk about lots of different healing modalities, and I have a decent amount of people that come on and talk about anxiety and things like that. I do some solo episodes where I share some tidbits about the work I do. So I'm certified in the work of Dr. Brene Brown,
Hmm.
have been since 2014, and it's around shame resilience, which if you would
Hmm.
have told me this is the work I'm going to be doing, like back when I was in my 20s, I would have laughed hysterically. But
Right.
I think it truly was the work that I needed to do.
Hmm.
But it really any and some people ask like why shame resilience? Like why you got to go that deep into the deep end? And it goes back to what we were talking about around those behaviors of perfectionism and people pleasing and poor
Hmm.
boundaries because
Hmm.
when you are engaging in those, which we all do from time to time in varying levels, we are doing that in an effort to avoid shame. So shame is essentially driving the bus of our lives a lot of time and we don't know it. So
Hmm.
that's why I'm passionate about doing this work for people to be able to exhibit behaviors that they're proud of.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of shame stuff that comes up in motherhood.
A
For
hundred
like all of
percent.
our unhealed stuff turns out comes up like when we have kids.
Yeah.
It's
Oh yeah.
uh,
Raising children, I think has been like raising children and owning my own business has both been the most, I was going to say excruciating, and it's not that far off, but just if you want a personal development workshop, then look at that because yes,
right.
especially teenagers, I felt like have
Mhm.
really shown me
Mhm.
a mirror of my own
Mhm.
stuff.
Yeah. What would you like to leave the listeners with today?
I would love to. end on what we were just talking about around shame resilience. And, it, it comes down to a couple of different techniques that we really dig into when I take someone through, and it's it's an 11 module facilitation that I take people through, but one of the main tools is around self-compassion. And I know I mentioned it briefly, but
Hmm.
it is one of those things where for most of us it can feel like learning a new language. It's not
Right.
something I just like teach you how to do it with a PDF and you're good to
Hmm.
go.
Hmm.
It's still for me is something I intentionally and consciously have to work on, and so does everyone that I take through the
Yeah.
work. So self-compassion is possible. It's about rewiring your brain, which brain science tells us that it's possible, which is very
Right.
exciting. I love science-based personal growth work,
Yeah.
but if I'm going to leave anybody with anything, it would be try to be conscious of how you speak to yourself
Hmm.
and give yourself some grace as much as possible.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story and all of the work that you're doing and how you're helping people now. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. It's been such a great conversation.
Thank you again, Andrea, for joining us. If you'd like to get connected with Andrea, go to AndreaOwen.com. You can find her on Facebook at Hey Andrea Owen and on Instagram and TikTok at Hey Andrea Owen. I want to thank you all for joining us today. And if you haven't yet, go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to this podcast and be sure to give it a rating. The more ratings we get, the more people can find this really invaluable resource. You know, and I know that hearing stories, sharing stories is one of the paths to healing, and it's so important for people to know that this podcast exists. I thank you so much for being with us. Until next time.